The chain snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The bulldozers had failed. The winch had failed. The crane operator had taken one look at the edge of that swamp and refused to get within 100 feet of it. And Frank Donnelly, the biggest contractor in eastern Iowa, a man who employed 150 workers and had built bridges and highways and schools, was watching $600,000 worth of equipment disappear into the mud 1 inch at a time. He had tried everything. Then a 72-year-old farmer pulled up to the edge of his construction site in a John Deere tractor, climbed down slowly, and said 4 words that made every engineer on the crew start laughing. "I can pull it out." What Frank Donnelly didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Walter Brennan had been watching from the tree line for 3 days. Waiting. Because he already knew exactly what that swamp would do to modern machinery. He'd seen it before. Not personally, but the machine sitting in his shed behind the barn had. And that machine was 80 years old. Walter Brennan had farmed the same 400 acres in Clayton County, Iowa, for 50 years. His hands were the kind that told a story before he spoke. Thick across the knuckles, permanently stained at the creases, the hands of a man who had never once hired out work he could do himself. He moved slowly, but never wasted a step. He watched everything. He said very little. He had watched the construction crews arrive that spring. Watched them grade and survey and pour concrete. Watched them bring in equipment worth more than his entire farm. He hadn't complained when their traffic tore up the county road. Hadn't complained when they told him his fence line needed to move because the original survey had been wrong. Walter Brennan wasn't a man who complained. He was a man who observed and filed away what he saw and waited to see how things resolved themselves. And when they didn't resolve themselves, he acted. What Frank Donnelly saw when he looked at Walter was an old man in worn overalls with mud on his boots. What he didn't see was 50 years of reading land, reading weather, reading machines. What he didn't see was the shed behind the barn and what was inside it. Walter's grandfather, August Brennan, had bought the machine new in 1912 for $3,200. That was a fortune then, more than most farms cost. August had used it for 20 years, pulling threshing machines from farm to farm at harvest, dragging stumps out of fields being cleared for planting, doing the heavy work that horses couldn't handle and smaller machines wouldn't attempt. When gasoline tractors arrived in the 1930s, most farmers scrapped their steamers. Too slow, too expensive to run, too demanding. August Brennan couldn't do it. He parked his Case 110 in the shed behind the barn, covered it with canvas, and told himself he might need it again someday. He never did. He died in 1952, and the machine sat untouched for 30 more years. Walter found it in 1984 when he was cleaning out the old shed. He pulled back the canvas, and it was all still there. Every gear, every valve, every brass fitting, rusted and dusty but intact. The boiler still held pressure when he tested it. The gears still turned when he cranked them by hand. He spent 3 years restoring it. Tracked down a retired machinist in Dubuque who still remembered working on steamers in his youth. Hunted original parts from collectors across the Midwest. Learned to operate it from old manuals and older men. By 1987, the case was running again. Walter fired up the boiler once a month, just to keep everything moving, just to hear the whistle cross the Iowa flatland. He'd always believed the old machine was something extraordinary. He'd just never had a chance to prove it. Frank Donnelly had been bleeding money for 3 days. The Caterpillar 375, 60 tons of hydraulic power, the newest machine in his fleet, had punched through a thin crust of dried earth into the black muck beneath on the first morning. It had dropped like something swallowed whole. By the time the crew got to the edge, only the cab was visible, the yellow paint streaked with mud, the tracks gone completely beneath the surface. The D8 bulldozers pulled until their own tracks started slipping. The chains groaned, and one of them snapped clean. The recovery company from Des Moines anchored a 50-ton winch to a concrete foundation half a mile away, and the anchor ripped out of the ground. The crane operator shook his head before he even reached the edge. You want 2 machines stuck instead of 1. $20,000 a day in delays. Insurance wouldn't cover it. Operator error, per the fine print. The sky crane option would cost $15,000 an hour, and it was sitting in Minnesota. Draining the swamp would take a month and $1 million. The engineers had gone quiet, which was the worst sign of all. That was the moment Walter Brennan climbed down from his John Deere. Frank barely looked at him. When Walter said he could pull the excavator out, Frank laughed. Not a polite laugh. A full laugh. The laugh of a man who had spent 20 years proving he was smarter than everyone around him, and couldn't imagine a scenario in which a 72-year-old farmer in worn overalls had something to teach him. With what, Grandpa? Your John Deere? Not with the John Deere, Walter said. With my steamer. The engineers chuckled. The workers stopped to listen. The laughter spread across the site. Walter waited for it to settle. Your machines make horsepower, he said. Mine makes torque. There's a difference. It took Walter 2 hours to fire up the steam engine. You couldn't rush a steamer. You built the fire, heated the water, let the pressure climb slowly until the gauges told you it was time. Walter had done it hundreds of times. He never hurried. Steam under pressure was not something you disrespected. The construction crew heard the engine before they saw it. First the sound, a deep, rhythmic chuffing, like the breathing of something enormous. Then the ground vibration, the steel cleats biting into the gravel road with each rotation of the massive wheels. Then the whistle. The Case 110 crested the small rise above the construction site, and every man on that crew went still. It was massive, 22 tons of iron and steel. A boiler gleaming black, freshly painted. Brass fittings catching the September light. Drive wheels 6 feet tall, studded with steel cleats, turning slow and steady as Walter guided it down the slope toward the swamp. Jesus Christ, one of the engineers said quietly. Frank's smile was still on his face, but it had gotten smaller. Walter set the brake, climbed down, and uncoiled a chain from the back of the machine. Links as thick as a man's wrist. Forged steel that had been in his family as long as the engine itself. He walked it out through the swamp, his boots sinking, the mud rising to his chest before he hooked it to the excavator's frame. Then walked back to solid ground without a word. You sure about this? Frank called out, and there was no mockery left in his voice. Just something closer to worry. If something goes wrong, Walter said, then I'll owe you an excavator. He climbed up onto the platform and put his hand on the throttle. But nothing's going to go wrong. He opened it. The steam engine's sound changed, a deep, resonant engagement as the pistons began to drive, as the gears meshed, as 80 years of engineering woke up. The drive wheels turned. They didn't spin. They didn't slip. Each steel cleat found the earth beneath the mud and held it. The chain went taut. The excavator groaned. The whole machine shuddered. Then it moved. 1 inch. 2 inches. Then a foot. Then another. The construction crew started screaming, not in panic, but in something close to disbelief, watching 60 tons of modern machinery being drawn out of a swamp by something their great-grandfathers had built. 20 feet. 30. The mud released the excavator's tracks with a long, sucking sound, like the earth was reluctant to let go. Walter pulled it a full 100 feet past the edge before he closed the throttle, just to be sure. Then he set the brake and let out the steam whistle. The sound crossed the Iowa flatland in every direction. Frank Donnelly stood with his arms at his sides and said nothing at all. Frank came to Walter's farm the next morning. Walter was in the barn cleaning mud from the steam engine's wheels when he heard the truck. He kept working until Frank's shadow fell across the floor. I came to apologize. Walter kept cleaning. I laughed at you. In front of my whole crew. Called your machine a museum piece. You did. I was wrong. Walter set down his rag and looked at him. Your machines are built to protect themselves, Walter said. When the load gets too heavy, they back off. When the wheels start to slip, the computer cuts power. Smart engineering. But there's a limit to what they'll do. He laid a hand on the boiler. This machine doesn't know that limit. It just pulls. The only computer is the man running it. And that man has to know when to stop and when to keep going. Frank wrote a check to the Clayton County Historical Society for $10,000, more than the society had ever received at one time. Enough to begin building a proper museum. I won't forget what you did, Frank said. Most people forget, Walter said. I won't. Over the next 5 years, Walter and his 1912 case pulled 11 pieces of modern equipment from impossible situations. Excavators, bulldozers, grain trucks, 3 combines that got stuck in that same swamp 3 years running. He never charged for the work. Every rescue ended the same way. A donation to the Historical Society, whatever the owner could afford. The museum they built with that money placed the case at its center. The plaque read, "Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built." Walter Brennan died in 2001, on a September morning, on the porch of the farmhouse where he'd spent his entire life. A cup of coffee in his hand. the steam engine visible from where he sat. In 2015, 23 years after the original rescue, Brennan got a call. A Caterpillar excavator had gone into the same swamp. The operator was Frank Donnelly's grandson, who had taken over the family construction company. "Your grandfather warned me about this swamp," the young man said, watching the steam engine work. "He said the only thing that could get equipment out of here was your family's machine." "What did you say to that?" "I said that was ridiculous. We have better technology now." Martin didn't answer. He watched the chain go taut. Watched the cleats grip. "How did that work out?" The young man shook his head slowly. "About like you'd expect." When the excavator was on solid ground, Martin shut down the engine and let out the whistle. The sound crossed the Iowa flatland, the same as it always had. The same sound August Brennan had heard in 1912. The same sound Walter had carried across 50 years of harvest seasons and county fairs, and one September morning when a room full of engineers laughed at the wrong man. Frank Donnelly had stood at the edge of that swamp and laughed. His grandson stood at the same edge and took off his hat. Walter Brennan never advertised, never sought credit, never needed anyone to tell him what his machine was worth. He knew, because he had done the work of understanding it deeply, the way his grandfather had and the way his son would after him. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes the newest thing is always the best thing. And if you've got a story like Walter's, a piece of history that people laugh at until they need it, tell us about it in the comments. We read every one.